Sarah Mitchell had been home from Afghanistan for 8 months, but her mind remained locked in a war zone that existed 3,000 miles away. The 28-year-old former Army sergeant moved through her days like a ghost, carrying invisible wounds that ran deeper than the scar across her left shoulder from shrapnel that nearly ended her military career. She had chosen the small mountain town of Pine Ridge specifically because it was quiet. Too quiet, some might say, but that was exactly what Sarah thought she needed. The town had barely 2,000 residents, one main street lined with aging storefronts, and enough space between neighbors that she could go days without forced conversation. What she hadn't expected was how the silence would amplify the voices in her head, the ones that whispered reminders of things she was trying desperately to forget. Sarah rented a small cabin on the outskirts of town, surrounded by tall pine trees that created a natural barrier between her and the rest of the world. The isolation felt like armor, protecting her from curious glances and well-meaning questions about her service. She had grown tired of the automatic "thank you for your service" responses that people offered like band-aids for wounds they couldn't see or understand. Her daily routine was rigid, almost military in its precision. She woke at 5:30 each morning, completed a punishing workout in her garage, and then drove into town for supplies. The local grocery store, Murphy's Market, had become her primary connection to civilian life. She shopped early when the aisles were mostly empty and she could move through them quickly without unexpected encounters. The nightmares had been getting worse lately. Dreams that weren't really dreams but memories that played on repeat behind her closed eyelids. The smell of burning diesel fuel mixed with dust. The weight of her rifle in her hands. The face of the young boy who had stepped out from behind a building in Kandahar, his hands empty but his eyes full of fear that mirrored her own. She would wake in a cold sweat, her heart hammering against her ribs, reaching instinctively for a weapon that wasn't there. Dr. Rebecca Chen, the therapist at the Veterans Affairs Office in the county seat, had explained that these reactions were normal. Post-traumatic stress disorder, she called it, as if giving it a name somehow made it more manageable. Sarah attended her appointments religiously, sitting in the sterile office while Dr. Chen asked carefully worded questions about her experiences overseas. But talking about the war felt like trying to describe color to someone who had been blind from birth. How could she explain the constant hypervigilance, the way her nervous system remained stuck in combat mode even in the produce aisle of Murphy's Market? The medication helped, to a degree. The little white pills in their amber bottle dulled the sharp edges of her anxiety, made it possible for her to sleep for more than 2 hours at a stretch. But they also created a foggy distance between her and the world, as if she were viewing everything through thick glass. Sometimes she wondered if feeling nothing was really better than feeling too much. Sarah had been a different person before her deployment. Her mother still kept photos on the mantelpiece of the bright-eyed young woman who had enlisted straight out of high school, full of purpose and patriotic pride. That Sarah had believed in clear distinctions between right and wrong, had trusted that her training would prepare her for anything she might face. The woman who came home understood that the world was painted in shades of gray that no training manual could navigate. Her squad had been conducting routine patrols in a neighborhood outside Kandahar when the improvised explosive device detonated beneath their Humvee. The blast had killed Corporal Martinez instantly and left Private Johnson with burns over 60% of his body. Sarah had been thrown clear of the vehicle, conscious but disoriented, her ears ringing so loudly she couldn't hear her own voice when she screamed for a medic. What happened in the minutes after the explosion had changed something fundamental inside her. The enemy fighters had appeared from seemingly nowhere, using the chaos of the attack as cover for an ambush. Sarah found herself separated from her unit, taking cover behind a concrete wall with her rifle and whatever ammunition she could salvage from her damaged gear. For 47 minutes, she held that position alone, returning fire while trying to reach her wounded teammates on the radio. The young boy had appeared during a lull in the fighting. He couldn't have been more than 12 years old, thin and dirty, wearing clothes that were too big for his small frame. He stepped into the open area between buildings, his hands visible and empty, looking directly at Sarah with dark eyes that seemed older than his years. For a split second, she thought he might be trying to help, perhaps pointing toward a safe route or offering information about the enemy positions. Then she saw the wire running from beneath his oversized shirt to something hidden in his hand. The realization hit her like a physical blow. He was carrying a detonator, probably connected to another improvised explosive device planted somewhere nearby. The boy was a weapon, as dangerous as any rifle or grenade. Her training kicked in before her conscience could interfere. She raised her weapon and fired a single shot. The boy dropped instantly, his small body crumpling to the dusty ground. The device he had been carrying skittered across the concrete, coming to rest against a pile of rubble. Sarah stared at it for several long seconds, her fingers still on the trigger, before realizing that it wasn't a detonator at all. It was a small radio, the kind children use to listen to music or talk to friends. The wire she had seen was just the antenna, extended so the boy could get better reception. She had killed an innocent child because her fear and training had transformed a radio into a bomb. The knowledge of this mistake burned inside her chest like acid, eating away at everything she thought she knew about herself. Even after the investigation cleared her of any wrongdoing, even after her commanding officer assured her that any soldier would have made the same split-second decision under those circumstances, Sarah couldn't forgive herself. The boy's face haunted her dreams and followed her through her waking hours. She found herself wondering about his family, imagining parents who had sent their son out to buy bread or medicine and never saw him come home. The weight of that one terrible moment pressed down on her like a physical burden, making it hard to breathe, harder to believe she deserved to be alive when he was not. Coming home had been supposed to fix things. Everyone said that time and distance would help her heal, that being back in familiar surroundings would restore some sense of normalcy to her life. Instead, Sarah discovered that carrying her memories into civilian life was like bringing a wild animal into a house. The trauma that had made sense in a war zone felt alien and dangerous in the peaceful streets of Pine Ridge. She struggled with simple interactions that had once been effortless. Conversation required enormous effort, as if she were speaking a foreign language she had only recently learned. People talked about television shows and weather patterns and local gossip while Sarah's mind remained occupied with calculating exit routes and potential threats. She found herself checking locks multiple times before bed, keeping curtains drawn during the day, and avoiding crowds whenever possible. The hypervigilance that had kept her alive in Afghanistan became a prison in civilian life. Every car backfiring made her dive for cover. Unexpected noises sent adrenaline coursing through her system, preparing her body for combat that never came. She couldn't sit with her back to a door, or relax in open spaces where she couldn't monitor all potential approaches. What had been survival skills overseas had become symptoms of a disorder she was supposed to overcome. Sarah's family tried to understand, but their efforts often felt more exhausting than helpful. Her younger sister called every few days with updates about her job and boyfriend, speaking in the bright, cheerful tone people used around hospital patients. Her parents visited once a month, bringing home-cooked meals and carefully avoiding any mention of current events or military news. They treated her like fragile glass, afraid that the wrong word or gesture might shatter whatever progress she was making toward recovery. The isolation felt safer than these well-intentioned intrusions. In her cabin, surrounded by trees and silence, Sarah could maintain the illusion of control over her environment. She could wake from nightmares without having to explain her screams to worried roommates. She could spend entire days in combat boots and cargo pants if the familiar clothing helped her feel more secure. She could practice the breathing exercises Dr. Tessa B. Go. Chen had taught her without anyone asking if she was having another episode. But isolation also meant that her world had shrunk to the size of her daily routine. The grocery store, the gas station, the post office, and home again. She had been trained as a leader, someone capable of making life-and-death decisions under extreme pressure, and now she struggled to choose between different brands of breakfast cereal. The contrast between who she had been and who she was becoming felt like another kind of death, slower but just as final as the one she had survived overseas. Sarah's sleep patterns remained chaotic despite the medication. She would lie awake for hours, listening to sounds that probably meant nothing but feeling her body prepare for threats that existed only in her memory. When exhaustion finally claimed her, the dreams came immediately, vivid and detailed recreations of moments she would have given anything to forget. Sometimes she dreamed about the boy with the radio, but instead of falling when she fired, he would look directly at her and ask why. Why had she been so afraid? Why hadn't she waited another second to be sure? Why did his life matter less than her own fear? Sarah would wake from these dreams with tears on her face and the taste of dust in her mouth as if some part of her had never left that concrete wall in Kandahar. Other dreams were worse because they felt like hope, before revealing themselves as cruel tricks of her unconscious mind. She would dream that the deployment had ended differently, that everyone in her squad had made it home safe, that the boy with the radio had smiled and waved before disappearing back into whatever building had sheltered him. These dreams were almost harder to wake from than the nightmares, because they reminded her of possibilities that would never exist except in her sleeping mind. The mountain town's rhythm moved slowly, marked by seasonal changes and the predictable patterns of rural life. Sarah watched from her cabin as neighbors prepared for winter, chopping firewood and winterizing their homes with the casual efficiency of people who had performed these rituals many times before. Their certainty about the future, their ability to plan months ahead and trust that nothing catastrophic would intervene, seemed like a luxury she could no longer afford. Her own preparations for winter were different, informed by military training that assumed the worst-case scenario for every situation. She stockpiled not just food and supplies but also ammunition, first aid equipment, and backup power sources. When asked about her extensive preparations by a curious neighbor, Sarah explained them as practical precautions for mountain living. But she knew the truth was more complicated. She was preparing for a war that existed primarily in her own mind, fortifying herself against enemies that might never come but felt absolutely real in the dark hours before dawn. The therapy sessions with Dr. Chen continued weekly, a commitment Sarah maintained even though progress felt impossibly slow. They worked on grounding techniques, ways to anchor herself in the present moment when her mind tried to drag her back to Afghanistan. They practiced breathing exercises and progressive muscle relaxation, tools designed to help her nervous system understand that the war was over and she was safe. But safety felt like a foreign concept to someone whose survival had once depended on assuming that everyone and everything posed a potential threat. Learning to distinguish between real danger and trauma-induced paranoia required constant effort, like trying to speak two languages simultaneously. Sometimes Sarah succeeded, recognizing that the man following her through the grocery store was probably just shopping rather than conducting surveillance. Other times, the old instincts took over completely, and she found herself planning escape routes from situations that posed no actual danger. The hardest part was the isolation from other people who might understand what she was experiencing. Pine Ridge had no other combat veterans that Sarah knew of, no support group where she could speak freely about the specific challenges of readjusting to civilian life. The online forums she had tried felt simultaneously too public and too anonymous, full of stories that were either remarkably similar to her own or so different that they offered no useful guidance. Dr. Chen had suggested that Sarah might benefit from connecting with other veterans, perhaps volunteering with organizations that served returning soldiers. The idea terrified her almost as much as it appealed to her. What if other veterans could see through the careful facade she maintained in civilian life? What if they recognized the guilt and fear she worked so hard to hide? What if they judged her for the things she had done overseas, or worse, for the things she had failed to do? Sarah's relationship with her own body had changed fundamentally during her deployment and continued to evolve in complicated ways during her recovery. The physical scars from the improvised explosive device had healed, leaving only faint marks that she could cover with long sleeves if she chose. But the invisible changes ran deeper, altering how she moved through space and related to her own physical presence in the world. Her body had become both sanctuary and prison, the vessel that had survived experiences her mind was still processing. She maintained her physical fitness with the same discipline she had learned in the military, using exercise as both therapy and preparation for threats that might never materialize. The familiar burn of muscle fatigue helped quiet the constant chatter in her head, providing temporary relief from the hypervigilance that had become her default state. But her body also carried memories that manifested in unexpected ways. Certain sounds would trigger physical reactions before her conscious mind recognized the stimulus. The pop of a car backfiring would send her diving for cover before she realized she was safe. The smell of diesel fuel at a gas station could transport her instantly back to the moments after the explosion, complete with the taste of dust and the ringing in her ears that had taken weeks to fully fade. Winter was approaching Pine Ridge with the inevitability of a slow-moving storm, and Sarah found herself both dreading and anticipating the isolation it would bring. Snow would make her cabin even more remote, cutting her off from casual contact with neighbors and making trips to town more challenging. Part of her welcomed the enforced solitude, the legitimate excuse to avoid social interactions that still felt overwhelming and exhausting. But she also worried about spending months alone with only her memories for company. The short days and long nights of mountain winter could be brutal for someone already struggling with sleep disturbances and depression. Dr. Chen had increased the frequency of their phone sessions in preparation for the seasonal challenges, but Sarah knew that ultimately she would have to find ways to survive the darkness that had nothing to do with medication or therapy. The confrontation began on a Thursday morning that started like any other. Sarah had completed her usual routine of exercise and breakfast before heading into town for her weekly supply run. The first snowfall of the season had dusted the mountains overnight, transforming Pine Ridge into a picture postcard version of small-town America. Under different circumstances, she might have found the scene beautiful, but beauty required a kind of mental space that Sarah rarely possessed anymore. Murphy's Market was busier than usual due to residents stocking up before the weekend storm that weather forecasters had been predicting all week. Sarah moved through the aisles with practiced efficiency, her cart loaded with non-perishable items and basic supplies. She had learned to shop quickly, minimizing her time in public spaces where unexpected interactions could trigger her anxiety. She was in the cereal aisle, reaching for a box of generic oats, when she became aware of being watched. The sensation was familiar from her military training, an almost physical weight that settled between her shoulder blades when someone's attention focused on her too intently. Sarah's hand paused mid-reach as her nervous system shifted into high alert, scanning for the source of the scrutiny without appearing to look around. 3 men stood near the end of the aisle, their conversation having stopped abruptly when she appeared. They were locals, dressed in work clothes and hunting jackets, probably in their 40s or 50s based on their weathered faces and confident postures. Sarah recognized the type from her childhood in a similar small town. These were men who had lived in Pine Ridge their entire lives, who knew everyone's business and felt entitled to opinions about newcomers who didn't fit their expectations of normal behavior. The largest of the 3, a man with graying hair and arms like tree trunks, was staring directly at her with unconcealed hostility. His companions seemed nervous, shifting their weight from foot to foot and glancing between their friend and Sarah as if they sensed potential trouble brewing. Sarah finished reaching for the cereal box and placed it carefully in her cart, hoping that normal behavior might diffuse whatever tension was building in the cramped aisle. Instead, the large man stepped forward, blocking her path toward the front of the store. His voice was loud enough to carry throughout the market when he spoke, ensuring that other shoppers would hear whatever he had decided to say. "You're the one living up in the old Henderson cabin, aren't you?" His tone was accusatory, as if living in a rental property were somehow criminal behavior. Sarah nodded slightly, not trusting her voice to remain steady if she tried to speak. Public confrontations were among the situations that triggered her anxiety most severely, flooding her system with adrenaline that had nowhere productive to go. "Thought so," the man continued, his chest puffing out with the satisfaction of someone who believed he had won an argument that hadn't actually started yet. "Been wondering when someone was going to talk to you about your behavior around here. Making people nervous with all your strange habits." Sarah felt her heart rate accelerate, her breathing becoming shallow as her body prepared for fight or flight responses that would be entirely inappropriate in a grocery store. She tried to focus on Dr. Chen's grounding techniques, identifying 5 things she could see, 4 things she could touch, 3 things she could hear. But the man's voice was getting louder, drawing more attention, and escape routes were becoming limited as other shoppers gathered to watch the confrontation unfold. "What kind of habits?" Sarah managed to ask, though she suspected she already knew the answer. Small towns were notorious for their ability to transform privacy into suspicion, and her careful routines had probably been interpreted as evidence of criminal or antisocial behavior. The man's friends seemed increasingly uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation, but neither made any effort to intervene or de-escalate the situation. Sarah recognized their behavior from dozens of similar encounters she had witnessed during her deployment. Followers who were willing to watch their leader create problems but unwilling to take responsibility for the consequences. "Oh, you know exactly what I'm talking about," the man sneered, taking another step closer to Sarah's position. "Sneaking around town at weird hours, buying supplies like you're preparing for some kind of siege. That cabin of yours lit up like a military compound every night. Security lights going off at every shadow. People are starting to wonder what you're hiding up there." Each accusation felt like a physical blow, not because the observations were inaccurate, but because they revealed how thoroughly her attempts at privacy had failed. Sarah had believed that her careful routines were invisible to casual observers, but apparently every aspect of her behavior had been cataloged and discussed by people who had nothing better to do than monitor their neighbors' activities. The security lights he mentioned were motion-activated floods that she had installed around the cabin's perimeter, standard equipment for someone living alone in an isolated location. The supplies he called evidence of siege preparation were simply the emergency stockpiles that any responsible mountain resident should maintain before winter. Her shopping schedule followed patterns designed to minimize social interaction, not to avoid detection or hide criminal activity. But explaining these rational motivations would require revealing information about her military service and mental health that Sarah was not prepared to discuss with hostile strangers in a public setting. The irony was bitter. Her hypervigilance and security measures, developed to keep her safe, had instead marked her as a threat in the minds of people who had never faced real danger in their comfortable lives.
"I'm not hiding anything," Sarah said quietly, trying to keep her voice level despite the adrenaline coursing through her system.
"I just prefer to keep to myself. There's nothing illegal about privacy." The man laughed, a harsh sound that attracted even more attention from nearby shoppers. Sarah could see people positioning themselves to get better views of the confrontation, their expressions mixing curiosity with the kind of uncomfortable excitement that public conflict generated in otherwise boring small towns. "Privacy," he repeated mockingly. "That's what you call it? Lady, you're living like some kind of paranoid freak up there. Got the whole neighborhood on edge wondering when you're going to snap and do something crazy. Maybe it's time for someone to check on exactly what kind of person we're dealing with here." The words hit Sarah like physical blows, not because they were entirely wrong, but because they contained enough truth to be devastating. She was paranoid, at least by civilian standards. She did live in constant preparation for threats that might never materialize, and she was probably one trigger away from doing something that would confirm every negative assumption these people had made about her character. But she was also a human being trying to survive trauma that these comfortable, sheltered people could never understand. She was a veteran who had served her country and earned the right to live peacefully without harassment from small-minded bullies who had never faced anything more dangerous than a difficult crossword puzzle. Their ignorance didn't give them permission to torment someone whose only crime was trying to heal from wounds they couldn't see. Sarah's training had taught her to read people, to assess threats and respond appropriately to different levels of danger. The man confronting her was big and aggressive, but he was also soft around the middle and breathing hard from the exertion of standing and talking loudly. His friends were nervous followers, unlikely to escalate beyond verbal support for their leader's behavior. The growing crowd of observers were simply entertainment seekers, not participants in whatever conflict was developing. None of them posed a real physical threat to someone with Sarah's training and experience, but they represented something potentially more dangerous: the civilian world's complete inability to understand or accommodate the people who had fought to protect it. Their casual cruelty revealed the vast gulf between military and civilian cultures, the way combat veterans were expected to simply flip a switch and return to normal life as if their experiences overseas had never happened. "I think this conversation is over," Sarah said, attempting to move around the man blocking her path. Her cart was nearly full, and she had accomplished most of what she had come to town to do. Retreat seemed like the wisest strategy for managing a situation that could only get worse if it continued. But the man stepped sideways, maintaining his position between Sarah and the exit. His behavior had shifted from confrontational to actively threatening, and Sarah felt her nervous system respond accordingly. Her vision sharpened, focusing on potential weapons within reach and calculating the distance to various escape routes. Her body tensed in preparation for physical conflict that seemed increasingly inevitable. "Oh no, I don't think we're done here," the man said, his voice dropping to a more intimate register that somehow felt more menacing than his earlier shouting. "See, the thing is, we've got families living in this town, kids walking to school every day right past your little fortress up there, and we've got a responsibility to make sure those families stay safe." The implication was clear and infuriating. He was suggesting that Sarah posed a danger to children, that her presence in the community threatened innocent lives. The accusation struck at her deepest fears about herself, the guilt she carried about the boy in Afghanistan, the constant worry that her damaged psyche might somehow contaminate the peaceful world she was trying to rejoin. Sarah's hands clenched involuntarily, her fingernails digging crescents into her palms as she fought to control the rage building in her chest. This man knew nothing about her service record, nothing about the sacrifices she had made or the prices she had paid to protect people exactly like him. He had probably never been further from home than the county seat, never faced a moment of real danger, never been forced to make decisions where every option led to someone getting hurt. "You don't know anything about me," Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper but carrying an edge that made the man's friends take an involuntary step backward. "You don't know what I've done or why I'm here. You don't know what I've sacrificed so that people like you can live safely in places like this." But the man either didn't recognize the warning in her tone or chose to ignore it. Instead of backing down, he moved closer, invading Sarah's personal space in a way that triggered every alarm bell her military training had installed in her nervous system. When he spoke again, his breath was warm against her face, and she could smell coffee and cigarettes and the particular staleness that came from too many mornings spent in the same unwashed work clothes. "Lady, I don't care what you think you've done for anybody. What I care about is keeping my community safe from people who clearly can't handle being around normal folks. So here's what's going to happen. You're going to pack up your paranoid act and find somewhere else to play soldier. Because if you don't, we're going to make sure the sheriff knows exactly what kind of unstable individual is living in his jurisdiction." The threat was specific enough to be taken seriously, vague enough to be difficult to prove. Sarah understood that she was being given an ultimatum: leave town voluntarily or face official harassment that could complicate her life in ways she wasn't prepared to handle. Her rental agreement, her therapy sessions with Dr. Chen, her carefully constructed routine of recovery, all of it could be disrupted by malicious complaints to local authorities. But she also understood something that the man apparently didn't. His behavior had crossed lines that triggered responses he couldn't possibly anticipate or control. By moving into her personal space, by threatening her housing situation, by suggesting she posed a danger to children, he had activated defensive protocols that had been forged in actual combat against people who really were trying to kill her. Sarah's right hand moved almost without conscious direction, sliding under the edge of her jacket to the small of her back where she carried a concealed pistol. The weapon was legally owned and properly licensed, carried with the same careful attention to safety that characterized everything else about her post-military life. But it was also a tool designed for ending threats when other options had been exhausted. The motion was subtle, practiced, almost invisible to anyone not trained to recognize the specific movements associated with drawing a concealed weapon. But the man was standing close enough to sense the change in Sarah's posture, the shift in her center of gravity that preceded decisive action. His eyes widened slightly as some primitive part of his brain registered danger signals that his conscious mind hadn't yet processed. "Step back," Sarah said quietly, her voice carrying the same calm authority she had used when giving orders to her squad in Afghanistan. There was no anger in her tone, no emotion at all, just the flat certainty of someone stating facts about physics or mathematics. "Step back now and we'll pretend this conversation never happened." The man's friends had definitely recognized that something fundamental had changed in the dynamic of the confrontation. They were backing away slowly, their earlier nervousness transforming into genuine alarm as they realized their leader had pushed too far into territory none of them understood. The crowd of observers was also shifting, sensing danger without being able to identify its source. But the man himself seemed locked in the momentum of his own aggression, unable or unwilling to recognize that the situation had moved beyond verbal harassment into something much more serious. Instead of stepping back, he leaned forward, bringing his face even closer to Sarah's, apparently mistaking her controlled response for weakness rather than the warning it actually represented. "Or what?" he sneered, his voice loud enough for everyone in the store to hear clearly. "You going to shoot me right here in Murphy's Market? Over what, some hurt feelings? Lady, you're even crazier than we thought if you think you can threaten people just because someone called you out on your weird behavior." The words hung in the air like smoke from a fired gun, impossible to take back once spoken. Sarah felt time slow to the crawling pace she remembered from combat, each heartbeat stretching into an eternity that allowed her to consider her options with crystalline clarity. She could walk away, accept the harassment, and hope it didn't escalate further. She could try to de-escalate verbally, though the man had shown no interest in reasonable discourse. Or she could respond to his behavior with the kind of decisive action that had kept her alive when words weren't enough. The crowd around them had gone completely silent, sensing that they were witnessing something that transcended ordinary small-town drama. Sarah could feel their attention like weight pressing against her skin, their expectation that she would either submit to the man's bullying or provide them with entertainment worth discussing for months afterward. None of them seemed to understand that they were watching a combat veteran being pushed toward a line that couldn't be uncrossed once she stepped over it. Sarah's hand completed its journey to her weapon, her fingers closing around the familiar grip with the muscle memory of countless hours of training. The pistol remained holstered, but the man was close enough to see her arm position, close enough to understand that the abstract threat he had been making with his words had become a very concrete reality, measured in pounds of trigger pressure. "Last chance," Sarah said, her voice still calm but now carrying undertones that bypassed rational thought and spoke directly to the survival instincts buried deep in every human nervous system. "Step back, apologize for your behavior, and walk away, or find out what happens when you push someone who's already lost everything worth protecting." The man's face went pale as his conscious mind finally caught up with what his intuition had been trying to tell him for the past several seconds. He was not dealing with an ordinary person having an ordinary bad day. He had cornered someone whose reality included experiences his imagination couldn't encompass. Someone for whom violence was not an abstract concept, but a familiar tool that could be deployed with professional efficiency. Sarah watched him process this realization, saw the moment when his bluster transformed into genuine fear. His friends had already backed away far enough to be out of immediate danger, and the crowd of observers was beginning to disperse as people realized they didn't actually want to witness whatever was about to happen. But the man himself remained frozen in place, trapped by his own masculine pride and the public nature of the confrontation he had initiated. The silence stretched between them like a taut wire, vibrating with potential energy that could snap in either direction. Sarah felt her training warring with her therapy, her survival instincts arguing with the recovery skills Dr. Chen had worked so hard to help her develop. Every military protocol she had ever learned was screaming at her to end the threat decisively, while every civilian social convention demanded that she find a way to de-escalate without violence. But the man had made his choice when he decided to threaten her housing, her safety, her right to exist peacefully in a world that had already asked too much of her. Sarah's finger moved to the trigger guard of her weapon, not yet touching the trigger itself but positioned for immediate action if the situation deteriorated further. The motion was small, probably invisible to anyone standing more than a few feet away, but the man was close enough to hear the subtle sound of metal against leather as she adjusted her grip. His breathing changed, becoming rapid and shallow as his body flooded with adrenaline that had nowhere productive to go. Unlike Sarah, he had no training in managing extreme stress, no experience with life-threatening situations, no framework for understanding how quickly verbal aggression could escalate into lethal force. He was discovering, too late, that there were consequences for pushing people beyond their ability to tolerate abuse. The moment stretched like a held breath, the entire grocery store suspended in the terrible pause before irreversible action. Sarah's finger rested against the trigger guard of her concealed weapon, while the man who had cornered her finally began to understand the magnitude of his miscalculation. His face had drained of color, and sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cool autumn air that had followed them in from outside. Then, from somewhere behind the frozen tableau they had created, came the sound of a child's voice raised in excitement over some small discovery in the candy aisle. The innocent joy in that voice cut through the combat haze that had descended over Sarah's consciousness like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. She blinked, and suddenly she was seeing the scene through different eyes, understanding what she was on the verge of becoming. This was not Afghanistan. The man facing her was not an enemy combatant, but a frightened civilian who had never learned when to stop pushing. The people surrounding them were not potential threats, but neighbors, community members, people who would have to live with whatever happened next. And she was not the young soldier who had made that terrible mistake with the boy in the radio. She was someone different now, someone who had a choice about what kind of person she wanted to be. Sarah's hand moved away from her weapon with deliberate slowness, her fingers releasing their grip on violence as an option for resolving the confrontation. The motion seemed to break whatever spell had held the man in place, and he stumbled backward so quickly that he nearly fell over his own feet in his haste to create distance between them. "Jesus Christ," he whispered, his voice shaking with the delayed realization of how close he had come to discovering what combat veterans were capable of when pushed beyond their limits. His friends had already retreated to what they apparently considered a safe distance, and the remaining observers were giving the entire area a wide berth as if proximity itself might be dangerous. Sarah felt the familiar wave of shame and self-recrimination that followed any moment when her military training had taken control of a civilian situation. She had not drawn her weapon, had not made any explicit threats, had not crossed any legal lines that would bring official consequences, but she had allowed herself to be pushed to the edge of violence against someone who, however obnoxious and threatening, posed no real danger to her physical safety. The incident revealed everything she had been trying to hide from herself about her readjustment to civilian life. She was not healing as successfully as she had convinced herself. The therapy sessions and medication were helping her function, but they had not addressed the fundamental changes that combat had made to her nervous system and threat assessment protocols. She remained a weapon that could be activated by the right combination of stress and provocation, regardless of whether the situation actually warranted that level of response. "I'm sorry," Sarah said, her voice barely audible in the hushed atmosphere of the store. The apology was not directed at the man who had harassed her, but at the community whose peaceful morning she had disrupted, at the child whose innocent voice had pulled her back from a precipice she hadn't realized she was approaching. She abandoned her shopping cart where it stood and walked quickly toward the exit, ignoring the whispered conversations that followed in her wake. Outside, the crisp mountain air felt like a benediction against her overheated skin, and she stood for several minutes in the parking lot trying to regain control of her breathing and heart rate. The drive back to her cabin passed in a blur of autumn scenery that she was too distracted to appreciate. Sarah's hands shook slightly as she gripped the steering wheel, adrenaline slowly working its way out of her system and leaving behind the familiar cocktail of exhaustion and self-doubt that followed any episode where her military responses had taken control. Back home, surrounded by the security measures that had triggered the morning's confrontation, Sarah called Dr. Chen's office and left a voicemail requesting an emergency session. Then she sat in her kitchen, staring out at the pine trees that surrounded her property, trying to make sense of what had happened and what it meant for her future in Pine Ridge. The incident had revealed several uncomfortable truths that she could no longer ignore. Her isolation was not protecting her from the world as she had believed, but was instead marking her as different in ways that made her a target for exactly the kind of harassment she was trying to avoid. Her security measures and careful routines, developed as coping mechanisms for her anxiety, appeared threatening to people who had never needed to think about personal safety in concrete terms. More troubling was the realization that her recovery was not as advanced as she had convinced herself. The moment when her hand had moved toward her weapon had felt completely natural, the logical response to a threat that needed to be neutralized. It had taken a child's voice to remind her that she was no longer in a war zone, that the rules and responses that had kept her alive overseas were not appropriate for managing civilian conflicts. Chen returned her call within an hour, her voice warm with concern as she listened to Sarah's account of the morning's events. They scheduled an emergency session for that afternoon, and the therapist's calm professionalism helped Sarah begin to process what had happened without drowning in shame and self-recrimination. "You didn't hurt anyone," Dr. Chen reminded her during their phone conversation. "You recognized that you were being triggered, and you made a choice to de-escalate rather than respond with violence. That's actually significant progress, even though it doesn't feel like it right now." But Sarah struggled to see the progress through her disappointment with herself. She had worked so hard to build a life that would allow her to heal from her combat experiences, only to discover that she could be pushed back into soldier mode by a confrontation in a grocery store. The incident felt like evidence that she might never truly leave the war behind, that some part of her would always be on that dusty street in Kandahar, finger on the trigger making decisions that couldn't be unmade. The afternoon therapy session took place via video call, with Sarah sitting in her living room while Dr. Chen worked from her office in the county seat. The familiar routine of discussing triggers and coping strategies felt both comforting and inadequate in the wake of the morning's events. They talked about the difference between having a response and acting on it, about the importance of recognizing progress even when it felt like failure. Dr. Chen helped Sarah understand that the man's behavior in the store had been designed whether consciously or not, to provoke exactly the kind of response she had almost given. His invasion of her personal space, his threats to her housing situation, his implications about her being dangerous to children, all of these had targeted the specific vulnerabilities that combat veterans struggled with most. "He pushed every button you have, Doctor," Chen observed. "And instead of letting him turn you into the person he was accusing you of being, you chose to walk away. That took enormous strength, Sarah. Don't minimize that accomplishment just because it didn't feel easy or natural. They worked together to develop new strategies for managing similar situations in the future, recognizing that the morning's confrontation was unlikely to be an isolated incident. Small towns had long memories, and Sarah's near-violent response would probably become part of local folklore, growing more dramatic with each retelling until she became a cautionary tale about dangerous strangers and the importance of community vigilance. The practical implications of the incident were also troubling. Sarah's rental agreement included clauses about disturbing the peace and maintaining good standing in the community. If the man and his friends decided to file complaints with her landlord or local authorities, she could find herself facing eviction or harassment that would force her to relocate again. The stability she had worked so hard to build could be destroyed by a single morning's loss of control. But as the afternoon wore on, Sarah began to recognize that the incident had also revealed some unexpected strengths. She had maintained control of the situation without crossing legal or moral boundaries. She had recognized the moment when her military training was taking over and had chosen to step back rather than escalate further. And most importantly, she had heard the child's voice and remembered who she wanted to be rather than who her trauma was trying to make her. Chen suggested that the confrontation might actually represent an opportunity for growth rather than just a setback in her recovery process. By surviving the incident without reverting completely to soldier mode, Sarah had proven to herself that she was capable of functioning in civilian situations, even under extreme stress. The experience had been unpleasant and frightening, but it had not destroyed her progress or confirmed her worst fears about herself. "You're not the same person who came home from Afghanistan 8 months ago," Dr. Chen pointed out. That Sarah might have responded very differently to this morning's situation. "The fact that you're sitting here analyzing what happened instead of dealing with the aftermath of violence shows how much you've grown." As evening approached, Sarah found herself thinking about the child whose voice had pulled her back from the edge of irrevocable action. She wondered who they were, whether they lived in Pine Ridge or were just visiting with family, whether they had any idea that their innocent excitement over candy had prevented a tragedy that would have changed multiple lives forever. The incident had also made her think differently about her place in the community she had been trying so hard to avoid. Her isolation had not protected anyone, least of all herself. Instead, it had created mystery and suspicion that made her a target for exactly the kind of harassment she was trying to escape. Perhaps true safety lay not in hiding from the world, but in finding ways to connect with it that didn't compromise her healing process. That night, for the first time since moving to Pine Ridge, Sarah left her security lights on low settings that would provide illumination without the harsh brightness that had apparently disturbed her neighbors. It was a small gesture, but it represented a willingness to consider other people's comfort alongside her own need for security. She also made a decision that surprised even her. The next morning, she would return to Murphy's Market during the busy period when families did their weekend shopping. She would move through the aisles at her normal pace, make eye contact with other shoppers, perhaps even engage in the kind of small talk that had felt impossible before the confrontation. The man who had harassed her would probably be there, along with his friends and other community members who had witnessed her near-violent response. But Sarah realized that hiding from them would only confirm their assumptions about her instability and dangerousness. By returning quickly and behaving normally, she could demonstrate that she was capable of peaceful coexistence despite the previous day's drama. The decision felt risky, but it also felt necessary for her continued growth. She could not heal in complete isolation from the world she was trying to rejoin. At some point, recovery required taking chances on human connection, even with people who might not understand or appreciate her experiences. Sarah spent the evening preparing for this challenge, practicing breathing exercises and visualization techniques that would help her maintain calm if she encountered hostility or curiosity about the previous day's incident. She planned her route through the store, identified specific items she needed to purchase, and rehearsed responses to potential questions or comments from other shoppers. But she also prepared for the possibility that her presence might create tension or discomfort for other community members. If her return to normal shopping patterns made other people feel unsafe, she was prepared to alter her routines in ways that accommodated their concerns without completely isolating herself from necessary community resources. The night passed more peacefully than Sarah had expected, with fewer nightmares and less of the hypervigilance that usually followed stressful incidents. When she woke at her usual early hour, she felt something that she hadn't experienced in months. A sense of purpose that had nothing to do with simply surviving another day. She was going to return to Murphy's Market, not as a victim or a threat, but as a community member who had made a mistake and was committed to doing better. The confrontation had revealed her vulnerabilities, but it had also shown her that she was capable of choosing who she wanted to be, even under extreme pressure. As Sarah prepared for her day, she reflected on how much her understanding of strength and courage had evolved since her deployment. In Afghanistan, strength had meant the ability to respond to threats with decisive violence. In civilian life, she was learning that true strength often meant the ability to resist that impulse, to choose vulnerability and connection over the false security of isolation and defensive aggression. The road to recovery was longer and more complicated than she had initially understood, but the previous day's incident had taught her that she was capable of traveling it successfully. She was not the same person who had left for Afghanistan, nor was she the same person who had returned. She was someone new, someone still becoming, someone who had learned that healing was not a destination but a daily choice to engage with the world despite its risks and disappointments. Sarah checked her weapon one final time, ensuring it was properly secured and safely holstered, then headed for town with the sun rising over the mountains that surrounded her adopted home. Today would be a test of everything she had learned about living with trauma, while refusing to let it define her future. She was ready for that test, ready to discover who she could become when she chose hope over fear, connection over isolation, and growth over the illusion of perfect safety.